This program is brought to you in part through a grant from the Bankhead Foundation.
The best way to describe the 1925 season is to view it in retrospect, that is, as the first moment in what is going to become such a defining part of Southern life. If you ask people from the South or people from other sections about the importance of football to the South, almost all of them will say college football is tremendously important to Southerners. Therefore, if you start from the premise that football is important in defining who we are as a people and our sense of mastery over other regions of the United States, and we take inordinate pride in football in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and after, then you have to ask yourself, when did this begin? What triggered it? What magical moment was there that defines the South and causes it to begin to think of itself in these terms? That is, our athletic prowess versus your eggheadism. And that moment is 1925.
The 1926 Rose Bowl was without a doubt the most important game before or since in Southern football history.
Football is a game of the future in college life. Players will be forced to live a most ascetic life on a diet of rare beef and pork for additional courage and fortitude. Bill Little, Alabama captain, 1892.
It wasn't much of a contest. The Alabama Crimsons won their first official game 56-0. Their opponent, a team made up of high school players from Birmingham. The students on that first team, and nearly every team until World War I, were from the elite families of Alabama, society's brightest and wealthiest. The first roster included a future Speaker of the House of Representatives, fullback Will Bankhead, and a two-term governor, reserve Bibb Graves. The most dominant Southern team of the 1890s was the Sewanee, Tennessee Mountain Tigers. In a play for national attention, Sewanee went on the road and beat 5 major Southern teams in 6 days. But there would be little respect given the pioneer Southern powerhouses. Teams like Vanderbilt, Georgia Tech, or Auburn could win every game, but could only gain national respect by going north. So north they went. An ambitious Virginia team arranged the first challenge and traveled to Princeton. They lost 116-0.
So Southern teams would go north on what was invariably hailed as northern invasions in the Southern newspapers. They would invariably lose the game, and then they would come home to hosannas and much praise for defending the honor of the Southland.
The South did develop its share of intense rivalries. Alabama and Auburn had played nearly every year in a battle for statewide bragging rights. But the Classic turned bitter in 1908. Incredible bickering over contract issues led to the dissolution of the matchup. The two teams would not play again for 40 years. In 1912, the first great Alabama star, Bully Vandegraff, earned All-American honors, highly unusual for a Southern athlete. It was also the year Alabama recruited a Virginian, who for the next 25 years would have the most influence of anyone on the development of Alabama football. The recruit was the school's new president, 42-year-old George Denny.
Dr. George Denny was a visionary who saw what sports could do for a university. He realized that winning football teams could make people interested in your university and bring the alumni back, get donations from the alumni, and he proceeded. He was pretty much a dictator type guy, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I mean it as praise for him.
In the Roaring '20s, college football grew up. The country went sports crazy as thousands of athletes returned home from the war. Knute Rockne's great Notre Dame teams dominated the early '20s, and even Southern football gained a ripple of respect thanks to a tiny college in Danville, Kentucky. In 1921, the Center College Praying Colonels shocked the football world by defeating a Harvard team that hadn't lost in 3 years. Alabama had done little to distinguish itself in the huge 22-team Southern Conference. In 3 decades of football, it had never won a conference title. Yet President Denny continued to pour what resources he could into his team. In 1919, he hired Zen Scott, who played collegiate ball in Cleveland and had taken up a new profession.
Zen Scott, believe it or not, was a sports writer. So when people tell me, well, sports writers don't know anything about coaching, I say, well, the guy who got Alabama's first big intersectional victory was a sports writer. He covered horse racing for the Cleveland papers.
Scott was an easygoing, brainy coach, and the players loved him. His first 2 teams won 18 games and lost only 2. But he is most remembered for a single game in 1922, when Alabama went north. At Franklin Field in Philadelphia, the team now called the Crimson Tide shocked heavily favored Pennsylvania 9-7. But Zen Scott had been ill much of the season. Alabama's first great coach would soon die of cancer. To replace Scott, President Denny confidently pursued the best coach in the South, Vanderbilt's Dan McGugin, whose teams had won 13 Southern championships. He declined the offer, suggesting instead his assistant, a 30-year-old Tennessean named Wallace Wade. Alabama moved fast and offered Wade the job, but there was a problem. He was being courted by Kentucky.
He had practically decided to take the Kentucky job and was waiting in the outer office while the Kentucky Athletic Council haggled over his terms. Wade didn't like haggling. After an hour, he burst in on the meeting and announced he was going to Alabama. And, he added, I guarantee Kentucky will never beat a football team of mine. Time magazine.
He didn't put up with any shenanigans from his players or students or, I hesitate to say faculty, but certainly some of the townspeople. And believe it or not, as you know, he was called Bear for some 10 years before Bryant even made the scene down there.
Wallace Wade was a shock to Alabama's players. He loved intense, grueling practices. He was crusty, blunt, stubborn, and a perfectionist. He told his players during the season they must focus on football and football only.
If you came out of class, walking across campus, and there's 4 or 5 co-eds walking there by you, you didn't even know them. But the old man was coming down the avenue in his car, which everybody knew, a Chrysler, and you saw it coming and you just crossed the street. You didn't want to think you were associated. No, he didn't believe in dates.
But they were scared to death. The football players were scared. Many times we've been out together, and he would come up to us and tell Bruce it was time to go home. They looked on him as an old grizzly bear in his rough ways.
Wade insisted on teaching his teams football from the ground up and developed some of the best tacklers and blockers in the South. He drilled his men in every play down to the slightest movement of hand or foot, using a metronome to ensure proper timing.
Coach Wade was a fine gentleman, knew his football, expected you to carry out your duty and do it well. If you didn't stay there long.
Wade took over every aspect of the team and didn't appreciate interference from anyone, including his boss. Denny often said if he ever decided to quit his job as university president, he wanted to be a coach. He regularly attended practices on the field named in his honor.
Went out to practice every day, and as I remember him, he always had his coat over his shoulder, and they had a story during those days, if he didn't get knocked down on the sidelines at practice, we don't win the game, and he got knocked practically every time he'd come out there, he gets too close to the sideline, then when they scrimmaging, somebody hit him and knock him down.
Wade and Denny developed a public relationship of peaceful coexistence, but wrangled privately about everything related to Alabama football.
Well, he used to want to coach, and Wade used to tell him that he ought to be up in the stands. They were quite a pair.
Wade's staff included assistant Russ Cohen and line coach Hank Crisp, who would remain a fixture in Alabama athletics for 40 years.
Coach Hank, on one arm, had a stump. He'd lost a hand in an agricultural accident. But one thing he did, I guess you could say he was an architect of some of Alabama's great offensive lines, and one thing that he did to make certain of that is the fact that he would get a player down, a lineman, in the three-point stance, and he'd have him, and he would squat down right behind him and put that stump right between his legs from his back, and when he would say the snap count is going to be 3, and he'd say, "Signals, 1, 2, 3." And so when he said 3, that stump came up, and if the guy hadn't gotten the proper charge, then he was, let's just say that he had a memorable soreness for a long time at a key spot.
In 1923, Wade's first season, his team won 7 games, lost 2, and tied 1. The most surprising game was the scoreless tie against mighty Georgia Tech. A year later, in 1924, Wade's team ripped through its first 4 opponents, then became the first Southern team to beat Georgia Tech in 5 seasons. The torch had been passed. The Tide was on the brink of their best season in history. But against that pesky team from tiny Center College, they played badly and lost 17-0. At 8-1, the Crimson Tide took home the Southern Conference Championship for the first time, while the national press swooned over Rockney's Notre Dame, which won the mythical national championship.
Many times Bruce would go into a game bareheaded, which was just a really scary looking thing. But if you could have seen the helmets back in those days, it was just like you could take them and crush them in your hands, just like a piece of leather. And I didn't like it, but there wasn't much I could do about it.
Those were tough guys. You see their pictures, and they were just from small southern towns in the early 20s, and it was hard scrabble cotton country trying to make 25 cents a day doing whatever you could. And I know Dad told me about they had a big tackle named Buckler, he said was really a fine player, and a guy whose nickname was Cupid Perry. And if you see his picture, you can't figure how in the world he got the name Cupid out of all that, because he's a tough looking guy. So they shortened that nickname to Cupe.
Tuscaloosa absolutely refuses to bespeak any boy on the campus by his regular cognomen. It is prolific with and loyal to its affectionate appellations. Alabama has Lovely Barnes, Cupe Perry, Sherlock Holmes, and the usual bumper crop of Reds and Hots, and of course, one Pooley. Ed Danforth, Atlanta, Georgia.
In 1901, Allison Thomas Stanislaus Hubert was born to a devout Catholic family in Meridian, Mississippi. At a very young age, he was more than pleased to pick up the nickname Pooley. At 16, he talked his mother into letting him drop out of school and join the Navy to fight in World War I. He served on a destroyer, and at war's end entered the Missouri Military Academy to complete high school. He starred in 3 sports, and his reputation for toughness landed an invitation to play at Princeton University, the school that helped invent modern American football. He lasted 2 weeks. As Hubert rode a train back south, he started a letter to his mother.
He wrote her a 2 or 3 page letter saying how sorry he was that he was disappointing her, and he hoped she wouldn't be disappointed, but that the boys at Princeton weren't very friendly, all Yankees, and the professors he felt like were all atheists, and he wasn't going to stay there.
Hubert rode the rails through the South searching for a team, but the season had already begun. His last stop was Tuscaloosa. He spent the fall working out with the scrub teams. 1 year later, a 21-year-old freshman started taking command of Alabama's football fortunes. He looked and acted even older. His teammates called him Papa Pooley.
There's no quarterback in football history that ran a team with more authority than Pooley Hubert did. When you got in the huddle with Pooley Hubert, he told you what you're going to do, and if you didn't do it right, I'm putting somebody else in your spot.
While Hubert was the epitome of the gritty, hard-nosed player, Johnny Mack Brown made the game look easy. He was the speedster, the game breaker. Brown grew up one of 9 children in a close-knit family in Dothan, Alabama. Johnny and his 5 brothers would pound nails in some of the shoes his father sold for a living and play tackle football in neighborhood fields. Although a deceptive runner and dangerous receiver, Brown played little his first 2 years at Alabama. Aside from being a poor tackler, he had a terrible memory.
The players called him Dum Dum because he had a hard time remembering the football plays. Coach Wade, in fact, had to install a huddle system for Johnny's benefit. Champ Pickens.
By 1924, Alabama was huddling up and Brown was running wild, scoring 12 touchdowns. Grant Gillis, who played quarter and halfback alongside Brown, recalled his running style.
I could tell you some tales about him you wouldn't even believe. I have seen him run down that sideline and boys coming straight up the sideline would dive at him and wouldn't even touch him. His body, his whole body would be out of the sideline, over the sideline, his feet inside, if you can believe that now.
He had an absolutely glorious smile. It was a transforming smile. Apparently drama was something that engaged a lot of his time. One of his teammates tells an anecdote about his standing in front of the mirror and combing his hair back and talking about how much fun it was going to be a big Hollywood star someday.
At nearly every major college across the country, football was a sport for white players only. Still, there were a few exceptions. Northern teams like Dartmouth, Northwestern, and Rutgers often featured talented African Americans at key positions.
So as you get African American athletes on teams, a lot of Southern teams don't know what to do. They don't know whether to play them or not to play them. Curiously enough, some did. Some refused. It was even more of a problem when the Northern teams came south. And the rule of thumb was, if you come south, don't bring your black players.
Back in 1915, a Chicago-born African-American running back named Fritz Pollard led Brown University to the Rose Bowl and became the first man of his race named to the All-American team. Blocking for Pollard at right guard was a feisty Southerner, known at Brown as Wally Wade. In 24 years as a Southern head coach, Wallace Wade could never recruit a black player. But he and Fritz Pollard became close friends. Wade believed Pollard was the greatest running back he'd ever seen. But that was before the 1925 season. In 1925, Charlie Chaplin was in his prime. Walter Chrysler started making automobiles, and F. Scott Fitzgerald published The Great Gatsby. In the rural South, Chaplin's culinary expertise may have been appreciated. The Roaring '20s blew by. An agricultural depression lingered, affecting most of the region. Hostilities between the North and South were heightened during the summer by a case known as the Monkey Trial.
In which a young biology teacher was brought into court for teaching the Darwinian theory of evolution.
The whole thing was really created to garner publicity as much as anything else. And urban middle-class Southerners especially were horrified at the negative publicity that was generated from the Scopes trial.
H.L. Mencken at the Baltimore Sun is writing very critical and satiric editorials about the brain cavity size of a typical Southerner, and it's not at all uplifting or complimentary to Southerners. So 1925 is just a terrible year. It's the peak year for the Ku Klux Klan in the South. Its membership peaked 1925. It is the year of the Scopes trial. And all of those things sort of coincide in order to create an attitude in the state that we're under siege. Everybody is making fun of us.
When college boys by the tens of thousands start kicking like Coreens and exercising like desperate matrons, it's a sure sign that football has once more cast its spell upon the land.
By 1925, going to a football game was the thing to do on a Saturday afternoon in the fall. A traditional Southern football ritual caught the eye of many a Northern opponent. Female team sponsors an offensive attack. On defense, linebacker Hubert made sure Georgia Tech
at the same time. O.B. Keeler.
The people in Montgomery think you pointing out each man, called his name, and saying something about it, and at the last, he dropped.
Hubert ran for
all year, and you never guess who scored that Sunday.
Dishonesty and neglect of academic work. The conference.
They got no business coming out here playing these teams. They're not good enough. And
90 pounds, and every man stands over 6 feet. I personally
full of water from Alabama in order to cover every base.
Talks, poker games, and eating frenzies. The trip was punctuated by little 6-year-old Wallace Wade Jr. screaming out the window.
Alabama football team.
Tornado.
At the Rose Bowl game, and he wired all the presidents of the civic clubs in Tuscaloosa and told them to send telegrams out to the Alabama players that the honor of the Confederacy was on their shoulders. They had to avenge losing the Civil War.
Try to give us a good load with Model Ts. The stadium was filled near capacity.
Any place that was big enough to hold 100 people and they could string.
Any doubt where Singleton might end up playing collision.
He got up, pulled his helmet around and said, "Mr. Ref, timeout. Give me a timeout here." And Pooley walked over and looked down and says, "Now just what the hell's going on around here?" And to that he said,
Zealous was ran out in the half with the score still 12-0 Washington.
And kind of wonder what might have been.
And he's very broadly. He seems to be having a very good time, and you imagine, well, he's relaxing on the bench. And you suddenly look to one side and to the other.
Coach Wade had told Pooley not to do much running himself.
Point after made it 20 Alabama. The California crowd was now solidly behind the underdog Crimson Tide. A flustered Washington fumbled the Alabama kickoff, and Hubert sensed the kill.
Pooley told me to run straight upfield as fast as I could.
Touchdown off Washington with a pair of interceptions. Time was running out when Wilson carried a round end.
But Johnny Mack, by himself, brought down Wilson, saved the ball game.
And the final minutes go down, tick away, and finally the words that everyone wanted to hear, Alabama wins, flash over the wire. And the Grand Theater,
Washington, it would have been the battle.
Birmingham Newstead,
which will never be forgotten.
You did a whole lot of little towns, and people would come out and wave the red.
People, not only young people like myself at that time, to go back and
strays. About 150 University Mound. Atop the ruins of a dormitory to
Southern football history. What had come before was almost
Alabama's Rose Bowl.
Alabama once again went unbeaten and headed west to the Rose Bowl. For the first time, a national radio audience listened to straight games. Then reality set in. He recommending a contract to coach in Durham. He would have in 11 tries. A Kentucky football team never did defeat a Wade coach team.
Boys, happy games. They went to a total
years.
I remember
Waynesboro.
Right now,
the South had a new tradition for something else. In terms of causes won, not lost.
The University of Alabama, P.O. Box 87,000, Tuscaloosa, Alabama 354.